So is this the perfect YouTube video camera for 2022? Today we're looking at the Sony ZV-E10. It is billed as the successor to the Sony ZV-1, but this time with the ability to change out its lens because it's an APS-C size lens, takes a Sony E-mount, and it can also accept full-frame lenses. Now, I'm not going to give you a ton of detailed specs about this camera because it's been covered by a lot of YouTube channels, but I will talk about some notable details. Now, given the fact that this camera has an APS-C size sensor, it is larger than the 1-inch sensor that's on the ZV-1, and this camera can also be purchased with its kit lens, which is a 16 to 50 millimeter, 3.5 to 5.6 aperture. And it also has optical steady shot that's built into the lens, and it also has a rocker arm on the lens for zooming in and zooming out. And there's also a rocker lens on the camera itself to zoom in or zoom out. Now, you would think that 16 millimeters is the perfect field of view for vlogging, but you have to keep in mind that there's a 1.5 times crop, so that 16 millimeter effectively comes out to 24 millimeter on the lens. Now, it can shoot 4K 30 frames per second, but there's an additional crop on that 4K 30. But if you shoot at 4K 24 frames per second, there is no additional crop. So the field of view that you see right now, this is 4K 24 frames per second, and it's the same at 1080p at 30. Now, this camera has that great autofocus that Sony's been very famous for in its latest camera offerings. It has product showcase mode just like the Sony ZV-1, and it also has that defocus mode, which gives you that nice blurry background. Now, since we're talking about similarities between this camera and the Sony ZV-1, now let's do a quick little autofocus test between the Sony ZV-E10 and the ZV-1, and we'll also check out the defocus on both of these. So now we got the Sony ZV-E10 versus the Sony ZV-1, 1080p 30 frames per second, just to see how the image quality looks between both of these cameras, and also a quick little autofocus test just to see how it focuses. On the lens cap, back on me, lens cap, back on me. And then we'll try the defocus, so to see does it give that nice blurry background that the ZV-1 is really famous for, because defocus mode is really nice. It gives you the illusion of having a much faster lens than what you really do. Okay, so now we've got the Sony ZV-E10 4K 24 frames per second. The reason I'm not shooting in 4K 30, well, I'll show you that here in a minute. But it adds an additional 1.4 times crop on top of the 1.5 time crop that is with the APS-C lens. So kind of keep that in mind. It's going to get super, super tight. Right now I have stabilization set to standard, and this is what it looks like walking around. This hand holding this, it's going to be a little bit jittery. And also when you turn on stabilization on the active, you also get a little bit more of a crop, which we'll test here in a moment. But right now, this is just me walking around just to see stabilization and image quality. And then we'll also look at what the Catalyst browse can do regarding stabilizing all this footage, because like I said, it's very jumbly around right now. Now, as you've seen, rolling shutter is a little bit of an issue with this camera. But if it's a locked off shot, kind of like what we have here on a tripod or on some kind of camera mount, there's no issue at all. But you know, with saying that, this is supposed to be a vlogging camera, and if you're out vlogging, there's going to be some movement. Okay, enough of that, let's move along. And now this is with stabilization set to active on the Sony ZV-E10, 4K 24 frames per second, so you can see how much of a crop that we got in with going into active stabilization. Okay, now I've got it on a 4K 30 frames per second, so it is a little bit more of a tighter field of view as compared to the 24 frames per second. I'm holding this handheld straight out. I'm 6'6", so I've got a pretty long reach as far as my wingspan, so that gives you a little rough idea of how tight that the image can be. Now, I am using the D4 Mini as the audio source for this camera during that last little clip. And it is worth mentioning that the inbuilt audio, it does have some decent microphones in it, and it does come with a little slip-on dead cat to kind of block out some of the wind noises. But let's check out the differences between those two now. And by the way, the audio that I'm using right now, I've got the D4 Mini external little shotgun microphone on top of the ZV-E10 for audio right now. So a quick little audio test, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And now we'll go to the inbuilt audio, or the inbuilt microphones, just to see how it sounds. And now using the internal microphones on the ZV-E10, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I do have the little dead cat attachment on the top of it because it is a little bit windy out here, so we are catching a little bit of a breeze. Hopefully it blocks out some of that breeze. Okay, now this is 1080p at 30 frames per second. Using the inbuilt microphone, I took the DD off for that little audio test, but just to see how soft that the image is in 1080p compared to 4K. And yes, 4K is going to be a sharper image, but I'm just very surprised about how the 1080p on this one is not as sharp and as clear as what the ZV-1 is. Now, while the Deity D4 Mini did give much better audio, I have to say that the audio from the inbuilt microphones, it is pretty decent, and it can suffice in a pinch as long as you're close enough to the camera. Now, this camera does have all the picture profiles that Sony's known for, and what we're going to do, we're going to look at a little side-by-side between the standard profile and S-Log3, but you got to keep in mind that this is an 8-bit video. This was my first look at the Sony ZV-E10, kind of rough look just to see how it performs. We're going to get into some more in-depth testing because I want to test this camera with some different lenses, some good prime lenses, to see how does it perform as far as its image quality. We already know about the rolling shutter, but the question still stands, is it the perfect YouTube video camera for 2022? What I'm going to do is I'm going to compare it to the Sony ZV-1, the Canon M50, which has been a workhorse for me regarding YouTube videos, and also the Lumix G7. I don't want to do an unfair comparison and throw the A7 IV or A7S III against this because it's kind of apples and oranges because they're two different leagues. But for YouTube videos, if you're a beginner, is this a good enough camera? Stay tuned to that next video because that one's going to get really in-depth as far as picture quality, image quality, and is it really worth it? So until that next video, I hope you guys have yourself a great day, and I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye. Now let's do a quick little autofocus test between this Sony Now let's do a quick little autofocus test between the Sony